there's a debate going on in Congress at the moment, which is very interesting, in that a number of senators are lobbying for money in the coming financial year to support dissident groups and human rights groups in areas like this, to support censorship-busting digital technology. It has a lot of support from human rights groups, but it has, of course, some skepticism from others, including me and the mainstream media, who spend much of the time trying to disassociate fact from the fiction, trying to figure out what's real and what's not. And if we've now got US government or Western government-sponsored groups with new technology penetrating into these areas, it makes it even more difficult. The mistrust is certainly there from mainstream to the social media and even to the online media in itself. And I'll give you a good example. Don't know how many of you watched the Michael Jackson Hour Evolved. It took about an hour between the time that Michael Jackson's hospitalization was first reported to the time that his death was reported. Now, most of you probably realize that the story was broken by TMZ, or TMZ as we say outside America. But TMZ is a website, probably a mainstream website, show business website in Hollywood. It's actually owned by Time Warner, same owners of CNN. They broke the story, and of course the mainstream media quickly picked up on it. It came to my attention at about 10 to 7 in the morning when I was flicking through the various news channels as I would do on a normal working day. And so I cottoned on. I first heard it on Channel 9, who sourced it to TMZ. Then I went to BBC World, CNN and Fox. Interesting enough, the only other network that was sourcing it to an online site was the BBC World. As far as I know, and I can't be sure because I didn't spend all my time watching either Fox or CNN in the next hour, but both those networks were talking about various news sources. They failed or did not seem to want to acknowledge an online site as provider of that story. They got a bit more interested in talking about online when an established print media site, the LA Times, got involved in the story as well. And I think in the end, I heard the confirmation of the death, sourcing TMZ, on both 9 and BBC round about the same time. We're talking shortly before 8 o'clock Australian time. It was another 30 minutes, I understand, from cross-checking afterwards before the CNN actually quoted the LA coroner as saying that Michael was dead. So it's interesting that even with the mainstream media, there is still this skepticism towards what I regard to a certain extent as online, let alone the social media. The key factor, I think, I'll quickly talk about the death of Nina Sultani, the girl in Iran, which was probably the iconic image of the uprising. I've spoken to both the head of BBC News Gathering and the head of Reuters TV in New York, and that posed a real dilemma for them. It was first put on YouTube and Facebook by an Iranian expat in Holland, who they believe got the images from a doctor who was at the scene at the time. Reuters had a real problem with it. The two issues, of course, were verifying that this was not a stunt or a hoax, and the second part, the problem that they still grapple with, who owns the image? What's the copyright to this particular image, which has now been published globally around the world, but mainstream realizing that they too have to be accountable for any claim that they may get on this. Now, as far as I can understand from both the BBC and Reuters, they do not know who actually shot that image and who rightfully has claim to it. And that's probably out of fear, the person itself not wanting to do that. But I raise that because these are the mainstream issues that mainstream media face. And so I'm trying to actually give some credit to the mainstream for taking a more cautious approach. But both the mainstream and the social media need each other and have to learn to interact. And when one becomes the other, social becomes mainstream, then let's see what eventuates from there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. And our final panellist in this session, Jason Wilson, is a lecturer at the Uni of Wollongong and also writes for New Media. Jason.
Hi all. Nice to see so many avatars come to life today. So this is a complicated topic, obviously, to address in a few minutes, but here goes. I want to say myself that I think the events earlier this year revealed a lot about Twitter's affordances and constraints as a platform for communication, news, networking. And that means we should sort of try to be nuanced in the way that we think and talk about its role. A few different perspectives I bring. I'm an academic. I've worked as a practitioner, as Fran said earlier. Mainly I was asked here as someone who writes for New Matilda about these issues. But most of all, I'm an avid user. But today I'm going to try and analyse rather than evangelise, because I think Twitter's pretty good at evangelising itself. Twitter's affordances first. It was amazing to watch how people were mobilised using this technology to talk about and invest in events in a faraway country. It was extraordinary. I think everyone would say it was extraordinary to read in real time the relay of commentary from people who are inside the country and directly involved in the event. And I think there was a genuine expression of empathy for Iranian protesters on the part of many people who, for example, greened their avatars and were willing to spread scarce information from within Iran as widely as possible. It was also great to get real-time expert commentary, although maybe he says he's not an expert, from experienced journalists and Iran watchers like Mark. And there was a brief moment where Twitter seemed to help people to establish a different kind of relationship with major geopolitical events than is allowed by broadcast media or any form of traditional media. It also seemed different from my own prior experiences of user-driven online platforms. The best way I can describe it for the moment is that it seemed more intense, maybe because of its real-time communal aspects. But some of the claims made for Twitter, especially in the heat of the moment, were too bold. Especially, I think, the way Twitter was talked about risked writing out the long history of the Iranian political blogosphere. It's extensive and diverse, and it's the venue for complex political debate that belies the sometimes simplistic version of events that seem to be prevalent on Twitter. If any one communications platform can be credited with helping people make the brave decision to put their bodies on the line in the streets, it's probably the blogs. Researchers know how large Iran's online public sphere is and how crucial it's been in preserving a space for dissent, and I don't think Iranian people were waiting around for Twitter as a focus for that dissent. Further, a lot of the protest organising that was done via social networks was accomplished in a pretty straightforward way, straightforward broadcast fashion almost, using announcements from Facebook pages associated with candidates and the like. Within Iran, where the government moved quickly to limit and monitor internet use, word-of-mouth handbills, a lot of old media seemed to play an important role in organising protest. YouTube was important for getting video out, and the point is, when we get too excited about the newest platform, we fail to recognise that most political action is always interwoven with a whole ecology of information and communication practices, including some pretty old stuff. Twitter gave us a new way to track events, but we weren't confronting the Iranian state, those of us here in Australia. More than this, there was too little said regarding what these events revealed about Twitter's limitations. One thing to think about briefly is how the value, neutrality and accessibility of a tool like Twitter is a two-way street, as is the absence of gatekeepers. If information is highly spreadable, so too are errors and deliberate falsehoods. It's easier to retweet something than it is to check the source and where it's coming from and its accuracy. And it's difficult to ensure over time that people communicating from inside a country in turmoil are who they say they are. Life and death situations throw all of this into some relief, and report first, check later can be dangerous in those kinds of situations. I've previously advocated the position that digital literacy for social networks needs to encompass some of the attitude to querying sources that an ideal version, and I stress an ideal version of journalistic practice embodies. That's a longer conversation. The tone of the rhetoric surrounding Twitter then, and maybe still now, is familiar to media historians. That's my doctoral training was in that area. It resembles what's greeted every new medium throughout industrial modernity. I'm not doubting Twitter's usefulness, but I'm saying that this revolution has been announced before. There are some fallacies of futurology that recur when new media arrive. New media are always seen as superseding their predecessors, but very few media technologies disappear from use in any simple way. They persist alongside emerging ones because they're still useful. New media are regularly seen as more transparent or less mediating than their predecessors, but when we settle down, we usually realise that no medium is a pure avenue of information. Each one can be used to select and frame events in specific ways. New media are often seen as democratising, but we've got to be careful about that word. What does it mean exactly, but beyond a normative endorsement? In fact, all media and all uses of media tend to gather different publics, and there's enough research about social networks now to suggest that they have specific audiences and are capable of excluding as well as including people. The last thing to say about Iran then is that although that election may have been stolen and appears to have been stolen, Ahmadinejad has a constituency. Disproportionately, they're rural and poor, and altogether they're the last people who are likely to fish up on Twitter. Thus, they're the last people we would have been likely to hear from during the conflict around the election. And there's a more general issue that arises out of that too. We here today are a specific group, and we're probably marked by specific privileges, and the Twitter user base, research is increasingly showing that the Twitter user base is not as inclusive as we might like to think. I think that in general terms, all of us, but especially journalists, need to be reflexive about the nature of networks that Twitter makes available when we think about this platform as a source of information.
Thanks very much, Jason. Okay, we've got 20 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty. So let's start first with the audience on the floor. Is anyone itching to ask a question here? And please, because time is tight, signal to me early so I can pinpoint you, we can get straight to it.
Thank you. My name's Laurel Papworth. I'm Silk Charm on Twitter. Just a quick question. There seems to be an awful lot that Twitter is about people connecting with strangers and taking information unverified. I thought Twitter was a social network and people knew each other, and I'm just wondering if somebody could kind of comment on that.
A social network, people know each other. I guess that's impossible depending on how huge it is. But during those events, those specific events we were talking about, I was certainly following people I didn't know, and whose identity I couldn't be sure of, simply because I was keen to try and see what kind of information would become available. I mean, it's actually in those circumstances. I take your point, but in those circumstances, it's actually very difficult to know who people are.
I must say, I follow lots and lots of people I don't know, and lots of people I don't know follow me. I use Facebook for my friends and Twitter as a sort of public forum, a bit like broadcasting in a way. It's not like broadcasting. It's more intimate in some ways and less intimate in others. But it's not just a social network for close friends to me at all.
I think it's quite interesting. The paradox is that as a social platform, it brings people together who don't know each other, and it's a wonderful thing. But as a journalistic platform, it can be dangerous. We can be lured into thinking that we've got friends here, people we can rely on and trust, and maybe actually disinformation is being spread to us as journalists. So there's an interesting paradox as where it began and where we're taking it as journalists.
Especially many of you mentioned in your talks about the fact that you didn't know where a lot of the Twitters were coming from, and they were fake, they were phony, they were being fed in. Yeah. So there's got to be issues of trust there, truthfulness there.
That's where I think some kind of mediation comes in. That's where I think journalism can be useful.
The sorting and the triangulation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Martin Hurst from AUT University in Auckland. Two very quick questions. One on ethics. We heard this morning from Mark about the new guidelines at the ABC, but there's nothing in there about how journalists should approach using social media. For example, the Neda Soltani one reminds me about, for example, an online death knock. What right do we have to take photos and commentary from people's Facebook pages, for example, in a tragedy situation where they've died? And one quick for Jason. Can you talk a little bit about the problem of technological determinism around things like Twitter? Because it seems to me that's a real issue. We kind of invest the technology with a lot more power than perhaps it has just as a simple tool.
I'll go first and talk about the last part of your question. Yeah, it's always dangerous, I think, to put technology at the centre of history or of any particular situation when really it's about our use of a particular technology that's important. Yeah, and how a particular technology acts to define events in particular ways. So you're right. I mean, it's rarely useful to seed, or to think about technology rather than ourselves as having agency in a situation.
Yeah, the answer to your first question is that the ABC does have a policy. It has thought through the policy about taking stuff off Facebook and so forth. I haven't got it with me, but there is a policy there. What was announced today was much more about a social media policy in terms of how journalists may express ABC journalists may express themselves on social media, and I think it quite correctly. It's loose enough to allow a certain freedom of movement, but it has at the heart of it that principle that you don't do anything that would compromise your own position or the position of the ABC. I mean, my own practice has been to try to work on Twitter in a way that does not leave the audience that listens to the program, for example, thinking, oh, he's already made up his mind on that subject. We know what he thinks about that subject. I try to be, as I do in life, actually, try to be as open as possible to the broadest possible range of ideas. But I try to carry that through onto Twitter, and I think that's what the social media guidelines that were released today are designed to do.
I imagine that's quite the challenge, though. That's going to be the challenge.
Yeah, you're always, walking a bit of a tightrope.
Let's go to our tweet board. Valeria Veo, will journalists become curators of content, sorting, verifying, distilling in a new media world of instant news? Now, Mark, that goes to what you said, but is that professional journalists as against citizen journalists? I'm not sure about those categories, but is that what we become? Is that the skills we bring to these the new real-time news?
Well, my experience is that you have to earn credibility. The old experience, and I was thinking about this when Tony was talking, he and I both worked under the same chief foreign sub, a woman called Annie Ringwood, and she was a fine journalist and a person of very, very high standards. But the standards that Tony was talking about just are not any longer applicable in a 24/7 news cycle. Of course, we have to check and recheck as much as we can, but last night I went on air back announcing a story where we'd had an interview with Bridge Lal, the Australian academic in Fiji, and we had just heard a report that Bridge Lal had been taken away by plainclothed men in military cars, and there was no way to confirm that. There's no free press, as I said on the radio, there's no free press in Fiji. There was no way to confirm it. We made the judgment that we would put that to air. Annie Ringwood would not have let us put that to air, but it's the relationship has changed. We are no longer sitting, as they say, ex cathedra. We're not the ones up there at the top of the hierarchy speaking down to the masses. It's a much more equal relationship, and you have to trust the audience. And you say, clearly, this is what we know. We're not telling you that it's absolute, but you can sort it out for yourselves.
Jason, and then I'm sure Riyadh has something to say too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's what Valeria said there. That's precisely what Mark was doing around the time of the elections. I mean, not gatekeeping, but pointing us in the direction of stuff that maybe was credible, making judgments in public, and in a way that a lot of us weren't able to. So he was being curatorial in precisely that way, I think.
And I think, Riyadh, too, your explanation or description of what you were doing in Al Jazeera to try and check the veracity, if you like, of the sources and the breadth of the sources, it came down to six sources, which puts a whole new light on this...
At the end, that was because they rounded so many people up. It was very, very difficult to get anything out after a while.
Exactly. And that's where the journalists come in. I mean, and it's not just about taking information out. My colleague Mohammed always says it's about giving information back and joining the conversation too. And that's equally as important for us as journalists. It's not just about looking at the information, joining the active conversation. We did that during the Gaza war, where we set up a specific Twitter account. There was a lot of disinformation that was out there, and we were able to join the conversation and put credible information and facts which we were able to verify out there that people were able to take. And for us as media organizations, we need to embrace that too and definitely include it in our strategies. I've not seen many media organizations who've joined the conversation proactively in terms of actually putting information out there, like joining the Hash Iran election hashtag, and add that to all of your tweets.
Does that mean the old golden rule that Tony talked about, get it first but first get it right, still applies? Is the golden rule still?
Yes.
Still the overriding rule. You've got to be aiming to get it right in the end.
Yeah. The thing about Iran was, of course...
I think there's a timeline there.
What it means is not announcing the death of Jeff Goldblum in New Zealand.
Yeah.
One call to verify.
I think the thing about Iran too was that it was the kind of perfect coincidence between the rise of Twitter as a phenomenon, which everyone got excited about, and a major event. And that was perhaps a novelty factor, not to reduce the importance of what happened, but there was a novelty experience that if we had 20 or 30 such events in the world in 5 years' time, would everyone be relying so much on Twitter? It was a phenomenon at that moment. I think we call it the Twitter revolution. I don't think we'd be saying that about every story subsequently in the world.
No, but it doesn't mean that we won't be relying on it. We just might take that as a matter of course.
You might,
rather be so surprised. We've got a question here and then one over here, I think.
Yes, my name is John Knight. I think I'm here as a Twitter...
Where are you? I can't even see you. Oh,
just
there
here.
You are. Okay.
Here as a Twitter consumer, perhaps. My question is to Riyad Minty, and it's about language. Clearly, we heard about the events in Iran in English. Al Jazeera's constituency mainly, I think, speaks Arabic, and of course in Iran the primary language is Farsi. My question is, was there a different discourse on Twitter in Arabic? Was there any discourse on Twitter in Farsi? And did you, from your situation, have an opportunity to compare the different discourses in different non-English languages at the time of the Iranian uprising?
Yeah.
Okay, that's an excellent question. I think in the Middle East, people are still scared to put their name and face towards free comment. It's still a very big challenge for them, specifically in the Arab world. Twitter users are few and far between. It's growing majority are expats. And in Iran specifically, once again, if you go and actually do the breakdown of people who are tweeting, and out of those 60 which came on the 6 accounts, majority were educated youth who were studying at universities and able to converse in English, and they were targeting an English-speaking audience to get the message out. And that was clear from the flow of information that was coming out. It was there in order to tell the world what was happening to them, not specifically to create awareness within Iran. And there was definitely, you could see that coming out.
Okay.
Mark Higginson from Nielsen. I have a question about your thoughts on that. As much as the news organisations have had to change and are changing the way that they view their role in news, also that how you view that the consumer's role is changing. That no longer, in the heyday of industrial media, the idea of loyalty to a news provider was singular, that people would usually buy a single paper and that would be their only news source. Whereas now, in the age of distributed conversations, people are actually checking the veracity in their own lives and using multiple news sources to check whether a story is true.
Triangulating ourselves, yes. Yeah.
Well, and this is the reality that we live in. People trust people, and you're going to trust your friends and your peers. On Twitter, with a URL shortening, you don't know who the news organization is anymore. If I get a link towards any news story now, be it CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, it's actually not CNN.com or aljazeera.net. It's bit.ly or tinyurl.com. So you don't know who the brand is where you're going to anymore, but you'll take it on trust from your friends. So you'll see enough of your friends will be talking about the same story or posting to their Facebook feed, and from there you'll click through. So this whole notion of the brand, it's not diluted yet, but it comes back to what I said earlier. It's about joining the conversation and making your content out there, because if you're not out there and making it available on these platforms, people are going to get it from their friends and it'll be elsewhere. So you need to be part of that discussion.
Anyone else on that point?
No, I agree.
No? Oh, yeah, I think it was following on from something that Riyad said. You talked about when you say you had to train reporters to use Twitter, what kind of things did you teach them?
Okay, so one was we put together a policy document, and it wasn't just a policy of how to use it, it had use cases on top of that. So these are the different ways you can use Twitter to get information out, to join the conversation. A lot of it was hands-on training, so actually sitting with journalists and showing them how to use Twitter and streamlining that process. So instead of having every single one in Al Jazeera on Twitter, trying to get sources out, we had an official account, so it gives a lot more credibility to when you're trying to approach people. So it was sitting down and hands-on and making policy within the network.
Okay. There's a lot of hands up here, so let's try and whiz through a couple, because we've only got 7 or 8 minutes. Up here?
Jan Forrester, a question for Riyadh again. I was even more interested in a way in the Gaza episode and the fact that there was so much real-time stuff coming out, but it seemed to be helped a lot by bloggers within Egypt, another country where social media is quite strong in the Middle East. So I wondered there, with the stuff that was coming out on the blogs in English, they were being translated by bloggers, how much of that was, could you determine from the original? I mean, did you have the ability to go back to the original Arabic? I mean, how are you actually checking these things?
So, I mean, I'm actually going to get into Gaza tomorrow in a case study, but just to answer it quickly, within our team and within the network is broken up to the English and Arabic networks. And with the Arabic station, obviously we sit and monitor the Arabic translation that's coming out. We have one common platform for user-generated content where people can submit to us, which both the English and Arabic channel will share. So if it's in Arabic and if the Arabic channel will pick it up first, obviously the English channel will take it from there, and vice versa. So we share resources going through.
Okay, there's one up the back here.
Eleanor Bell, ABC Continuous News. I'm just interested as to when regimes like Iran become more technologically savvy and their digital surveillance and monitoring follow suit, can we see a future of affording protection to social media users who could be tracked through their instead of their name, but their IP address or their unique identifiers and that sort of thing?
Okay, who would like to take that?
I think that's incredibly important. The whole ethical issue of that also brings into focus the issue of local fixes when, as television networks, we go into these places. I was just talking to Mark Corcoran from Foreign Correspondent at the tea break. He was telling me about the number of people that he had worked with in Iran who have either been seriously tortured, jailed, or in some cases even killed. And we have to be aware that we are using these people, and they may be Twitterers too. We should have some ethical consideration of what might be happening to them after we move on to the next story, as we do very quickly. The consequences, and as Mark pointed out, these people have very long memories. They can wait up to a year before they pounce on someone. So it's well and truly out of the spotlight.
Anyone else on that?
I mean, well, that was part of what was happening earlier this year. I mean, there was a considerable effort to provide people within Iran with proxy servers, access to proxy servers, so that they couldn't be detected quite so easily. But that kind of cat and mouse stuff will probably characterise a lot of these incidents for quite a while.
There was a concerted campaign at one point where people were saying, stop retweeting the names of these people.
Yeah.
But then a lot of those people then came out and said, don't be silly, my name's already out there, I've taken my own precautions, if you don't retweet me, then people won't know what the credibility of the original source was. Change for Iran was one of those. So I agree totally about the ethical considerations, but you also have to realise that some of these people have simply taken the very brave decision to put their lives on the line for this particular cause.
Yes, we are.
And one of the other interesting things that we saw in Iran was, with the videos that were coming out, some of the local Iranian press actually took the video and the images of people's faces, put it into the newspapers and saying, do you know these people? And actually published it and printed that to try and track them down. So, I mean, that's also another factor.
Scary stuff. I think we've just got one quick question over here. You've had your hand up, had the mic for a while. Somewhere over there? No?
Nope.
Oh, well, one quick one here, but then we've got to go.
Sorry, just a quick question to Riyadh about the Gaza experience. I know it's a bit off topic, but I understand that Al Jazeera put out video, kind of a website, and built up a video and had high-resolution vision. I was wondering how successful that was. I know there was a particular name for it, but how did that work, and how did other news networks receive that?
It was under the Creative Commons license, but to get into the details, I'm not sure if we have enough time. Tomorrow in the case study that I'm presenting, I'll go into a lot more detail into that. But just a quick answer, it was the indirect benefits that we saw coming out of that were phenomenal, the reach that we got, and even financial benefits in terms of people wanting to take our content further after that was phenomenal. Areas we didn't even see coming. And I'll go through those tomorrow in more detail.
Okay, look, that's all we've got time for. I think it's obviously an incredibly fascinating discussion, what lessons can be learnt from the social media lessons in terms of conflicts and foreign conflicts and uprisings. And it seems as though, all of you seem to agree, that a lot of the lessons are the basic lessons of journalism anyway, which is try to verify through multiple sources and proven sources as much as we can, and that's the challenge. But I think it was really, really interesting to realise that, of course, and we need to think about this all the time, of course the tweeting audience is not necessarily representative. It's representative of a certain percentage of the people experiencing this conflict. But could you please thank now Mark Colvin, Riyad Minty, Tony Maniati, Paul Cutler and Jason Wilson.